Good evening and welcome, everyone. I'm Valerie Peacock, the Clarice and Robert H. Smith educator here at the National Sporting Library and Museum located in Middleburg, Virginia. To our members joining us tonight, a very big welcome and thank you for your continued support of our mission and educational programs. To those of you who have not heard of us before, a very big welcome and thank you for being here. The NSLM is a special collection library and fine art museum dedicated to the preservation of and education about turf and field sports. These include angling, equestrian sports, and wing shooting, as well as advocating for the conservation of landscape, open space, and waterways integral to these activities. We invite you to come out and visit the library museum, open Thursday through Sunday from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. to see Field Notes, Walter Matia, the NSLM's first indoor-outdoor bronze sculpture by contemporary artist Walter Matia, on view until January 9th, 2022. Thank you to Susan and John Mullen for generously underwriting Field Notes, Walter Matia. Also on view are our two newest exhibitions, 2020 Hindsight, 40 Years of the American Academy of Equine Art in the museum, and In Focus Eve Prime Fout in the library. Both are on view until March 20th, 2022. Thank you to the Fout family on behalf of the Dunn Foundation and Virginia Guest Valentine for making these exhibitions possible. Before I introduce our speaker, I just have a couple of housekeeping details. We want this to be a discussion, so throughout the program, please feel free to take yourself off mute to ask Walter a question, or if you prefer, type the question in the chat. I'll be on the back end monitoring the program for questions or technical issues. To limit background noise, we do request that when you are not speaking to mute yourself, and this program is being recorded and will be available through a private link. Our speaker tonight is contemporary artist Walter Matia. His current exhibition is Field Notes, Walter Matia, which features 7 large-scale works, including wild turkeys, a pointer, a peregrine falcon, whooping cranes, and more on the NSLM campus grounds, and 2 interior galleries featuring sculpture, bas-reliefs, a fire screen depicting a variety of sporting dogs and hounds, bison, and wild bird and waterfowl. Several of the works in the exhibition serve as a reminder of the species that are threatened and need protection. Walter's study of biology, his early work as a taxidermist, a successful career as a conservationist, and his lifelong drive to observe nature as a hunter-naturalist inform his sculptures of wild and domesticated animals and bring them to life. He has won numerous awards for his work, including an awarded fellow from the National Sculpture Society, the Major General and Miss Dawn D. Pittman Wildlife Award, Exceptional Artistic Merit from the Prix de West Invitational Exhibition, the Evelyn and Peter Holler Memorial Award for 3D from the Society of Animal Artists, and many more. His exhibitions are as bountiful as his awards, with works having been shown at the National Museum of Wildlife Art, the Autry National Center, National Sculpture Society, the Cleveland Botanical Center, and many other esteemed venues and private collections. Without further delay, I'm going to turn everything over to Walter tonight. Please remember you're welcome to participate in this discussion by taking yourself off mute, typing the question in the chat. Thank you.
For having me. Do I have to do? Got it. Okay. There's a quote up on your screen, and every once in a while somebody says something that sort of summarizes so many of the things that you're working for your whole life, and you realize, boy, I need to pin that up on my wall. And I pinned this up on my wall about 20 years ago. It's from Antonio Paolucci, who's the director of the Vatican Museums. And he basically was talking about, he said the great animalist must have the capacity for realistic penetration and for abstraction to type at once the portrait of an individual and the portrait of a species. This really is sort of the holy grail of what I do and what almost anybody that deals in animal art does. They're basically trying to be real enough so you know what it is, but bring some other information to the problem so that they're not simply copying what's right in front of them. Next, please. This talk really isn't an academic sort of review of the history of animal sculpture. It really sort of runs through a number of the pieces and the people who have greatly informed my life. I do on occasion meet people who say they're self-taught. I am not. I have had terrific educational experiences, literally from second grade in elementary school all the way through college. And then I had 3 really wonderful mentors in my adult life who sort of guided me through my artistic career. Next, please. We're talking here about Western traditions in animal art, and I'm not going to bother to talk about either the horse, which you see on the left, mostly because it has its own long tradition. I'm afraid of horses, and so I really just don't delve much with them. I'm also, next, please. I'm also not going to talk about the long history of animal art in sort of Eastern traditions and certainly in Egyptian traditions. I'm very fond of this quote by Mary Oliver from, I think, her poem, I think it was called Peonies. You all can read, but the point is that anytime you try and say and block art into any different box, you find that there's all these outliers that simply imply you don't know what you're talking about. In this case, I'm going to start this lecture at about 1570, and there's a reason for that. But any of you who have been to the Met, you'll walk up the main stairs and you'll go to the right, and you're in the Egyptian room, and you'll see some of the most wonderful animal imagery sort of ever done. And this was in the 4th century BC, or 400 BC. Or you can go to the left, and you wind up going all the way down the hall, and the first thing you run into when you hit the Hellenistic sculptures is a little piece of a pair of children playing with 2 Hungarian partridge or gray partridge. And those 2 birds are as good a bird sculpture as I've ever seen, and this was done a long, long time ago. Next, please. Next and next. I mean, if I had the right pictures, I would pull up certainly those of you who have been to the British Museum and have walked into that room with the amazing Assyrian bas-reliefs of the wounded lioness and the lion hunt, or at the Met again, going through the Egyptian rooms, you'll know that animals sculpture has been going on for a long time. We're mostly going to start talking about animals as sort of the subject itself. The animal is the main object. It's not a symbol for something else. Certainly in the Assyrian bas-reliefs, it was the animal as a subject. The Egyptian work, all those animals basically had their own iconography, and they were a symbol for something else. Next, please. We're going to start this really, I mean, the first animal sculptor that I ever ran into was a gentleman, Jean de Bologna, who is known sort of colloquially as Geobologna. And he was in Florence in the post Michelangelo era. He was the go-to guy. If you wanted something done, he did it. And he is most famous for his large equestrian pieces. They're sort of all over Italy. But if you go into the Uffizi and you walk up the stairs, and if you can get past the amazing, you walk into that room and there's the 2 Botticellis, and they take your breath away, and it's almost enough to just turn around and say, okay, I've seen everything I need to see for the rest of my life. But if you keep going, you wind up walking up into a large atrium called the Bordello, and in the middle of it are, next please, and in the middle of it are a series of, I don't know, 15 or 20 sculptures of birds that were done in 1567. And they are some of the most amazingly observant depictions of animals, both as to type and as to individual. I mean, you looked at those things and you were like, there's a real bird in there, and he's caught everything about weirdness and the character and the body shape and the gesture. And they're really some of the first, next please, they're really some of the first animal sculptures that I'm aware of where the animal itself is the whole storyline. We're then going to skip literally almost 250 years, and it's not that there's nothing else like the Geobolognas, but in fact there isn't. And there's a number of reasons for that, which I'll talk about later. The modern animal sculpture that we think of today largely started with a Frenchman named Antoine Louis Berry, and he's probably the most familiar of the animal sculptors to most people who think of, oh, these are small animal bronzes. They were done by Berry. They were he was a fascinating man who sort of requires a little bit longer discussion. Next, please. The main thing about Berry to me, other than just how good he was at it, was that he really was the first person who was able to bring animal art simply as animals into the academic world of the French tradition. He was the first person to actually win a medal in one of the French salons, which was incredibly important because art in France in particular, which was sort of the center of European art at the time, so much of whether or not you became known was whether you won a medal. And if you won a medal, it's how you actually gained commissions. And in 1831, Berry submitted a piece of Gariel being devoured by a tiger. And it won I'm not quite sure which, it wasn't the gold medal, but it was right up there. And again, it was the first time anybody had done it. And it brought the idea of the animal as the animal itself being worthy of artistic exploration into mainstream European art. Next, please. Based on his winnings really within the salon, Berry also was one of the first people to actually gain some pretty serious patronage. And you all are lucky to be within driving distance of the Walters Museum. In 1834, he was commissioned by the Duc d'Orléans to do the piece called the Srila Tabla, which is, in effect, it was a huge series of about 57 or 58 bronzes, I can't remember, including 4 enormous hunt scenes. And looking at that, you don't realize that thing is about 3.5 foot square. It's an enormous piece. And there were 4 of them, which were in the center of a long dining table. And then they were surrounded with each of the place settings also had a piece that was smaller and from the hunt. The whole overall set of it was well, he was denied entry to the salon in 1834 with this piece, which was not such a good idea for the people in the salon, since it was the Duc d'Orléans who had commissioned it. But the whole set wound up being purchased by the Walters brothers from the Walters Museum in Baltimore. And about maybe 10 or 12 years ago, they took the whole thing out and set it up for an exhibition called Untamed. And it was a wonder. When you look at it, you have to understand that so many of the things that we deal with in modern sculpture, we have welding rods, we have ceramic shelf casting, we have all of these different things that they just didn't have, and they produce these bronzes that are some of the most extraordinary pieces you've ever seen. Next, please. Berry was also the first person to actually Well, he was a marketer. He was one of the first persons that ever took his pieces and then either reduced them in size or increased them in size and actually did them in additions. And he, I mean, literally, he was one of the first people that ever did this. So one of the upsides of that is that you and I can own a Barye. One of the downsides of it is that his pieces were cast in a number of foundries, both during and after his lifetime. And the quality of the pieces varies tremendously by which foundry did them. I hate to put it this way, but what day they did it, who was doing the actual metal chasing, who was doing the wax reworking. One of the weird oddities of sculpting at that time was that when your piece went to a foundry, the foundry actually owned the image. And when Barye died, his wife didn't own all of his imagery. And so after his death, a great many things basically were recast. And if you were in the market for these things, the simple truth is that unless you put a lot of time into it, you're simply not going to know what's a good one and what's a bad one. You have some idea, but this is where people, frankly, like Turner Reuter, who's on the board at the museum, and Cameron Shea up in New York, and a couple of other the dealers, are in fact really helpful in this because they will handle personally, 10, 15 different castings of the same piece, and they can say, well, this is a really good one, this is not a very good one. Next, please. The Barye was basically surrounded by a number of people who sort of came to join in this, and it was at a time when a tremendous amount of animal material, as it were, was coming into Europe from the different colonies from around the world. And so within the Jardin des Plantes, there was a menagerie. And the long and the short of it was an awful lot of this animal imagery was really based on the fact that all of these things were coming into Europe, and there was simply a market for people asking, what did that look like? Oh, I want a copy of that. This had really never happened before. And there was about a half a dozen people, next please, all based out of the Jardin des Plantes, who basically became what became later known as les Angeliers. The people that were surrounded there really were sort of the intellectual heart of the Animalier movement. And it started out with a whole lot of people doing dissections, and it moved from that to really some beautiful artistic expressions about the natural world that wouldn't have. Basically, it was just the time was right to do this. Next, please. The people involved in this became known, frankly, as les Animaliers. And again, I'm sure many of you have seen reproductions or castings of these things. They tended to go from those people who sort of lean literally, I put it as the exotic, the hunted, and the hunters. There was some terrific pieces. They all tended to be operating out of Paris. Next, please. Under Barye's eyes, and this had both good things and bad things about it. Probably the most famous of them that you will see pretty regularly are Emmanuel Fremier, who did a lot of really pretty, I mean, some really exotic, great things. Christophe Fretin, who basically was dealing with a lot of the monkeys and strange stuff that was coming into the menagerie of the Jardin des Plantes. And then Nicolas Kane, who probably was the most successful of them. Next, please. You know, along with those people who were dealing with animals that you know, were from afar, there was certainly a great deal of work put into you know, the history of the hunt. And next, please. And you know, this included, you know, people on horses, people on dogs, people, you know, whatever. And the question is sort of why did all this happen, and why was there such a huge blossoming of it? Next, please. And this is my list that I've tried to, you know, glean from my readings and thinking about it. But basically, Europe, I mean, all of these castings required a great deal of skill, and Europe simply had been at war for so long, and the currency of war was metal. It was gun locks. It was precision casting, and those all drove advances in the foundry technology to the point that you could make these castings. There was a hugely skilled workforce at hand. I don't know exactly the numbers, but I read somewhere there were 6,000 art foundry workers in Paris in 1856. Well, I don't know the population of Paris at that time, but I wonder how that would compare with the number of people working in the steel industry in Pittsburgh in 1938. I bet proportionately it was probably the same amount. There was certainly through the 1850s, right up through the 1890s in Europe, which was sort of the high point of the Angeliers culture. There was a lot of people were moving from the country into the cities. There was a certain, as you say, nostalgia for the old lifestyle. You know, people saying, "Oh yeah, I used to hunt foxes. I used to do this. I used to do that." And these small bronzes basically were sort of a memory point of traditions they'd left. There also was in every society where there's a growth in the middle class, there's sort of an emulation of upper class pursuits. And owning these things became sort of a, yes, you know, I might not own the villa, but I've got the stuff that's in the villa. Next, please. Next slide, please. I think this works. So why did this all sort of, by about 1890, the whole craze of this had sort of gone away. It lasted a little longer in England, where the sort of fox hunting and hunting tradition held on almost to the First World War. But in continental Europe, basically the art form had kind of run its course. Barry was dead. Really, very few of the quote unquote animaliers really, they didn't really take the whole thing much farther. But there were people that did. And they form sort of the next section here. But why don't we stop for a minute and see if I've left everybody thoroughly confused or bored, either way.
Neither.
Neither?
Neither confused nor bored. Excellent.
We did have a question sent in though. When did the foundries actually stop having ownership of the images?
I don't know. But I will tell you, it's not Roman Bronze Works, which is now closed, but which was the great American foundry from the 30s through the 80s. They published a book a couple of years ago of all the molds that they still have in ownership, basically in stock. Whether the estates of the artists who cast their own the reproduction rights or not, I don't actually know the answer to that. You know, I mean, obviously Rodin's pieces were held at Roudier Foundry, and they recast a number of them in the 60s and 70s. I mean, the pieces that are at Stanford and the pieces that are at Philadelphia, I believe, are all posthumous casts. And I don't know whether Rodin actually had a family that controlled that, or whether Roudier Foundry did it or not. I just don't know.
That's interesting. Yeah. Thank you, Judy, for just commenting a really interesting historical perspective.
Yeah, I mean, it really was a sad thing in Barry's situation, in that his wife died penniless, which was, I mean, as did the wife of the Duc d'Orléans, which was how the Srila Tabla wound up at the Walters Museum in Baltimore. And anybody who's interested in this, I really would recommend taking a run up there, because they don't have the whole thing out, and I don't know whether you could break the arm of a curator to take you back in the stacks, but at the time of that show, it was astounding. And when I said that it was astounding in ways you can't really understand unless you've worked at a bronze foundry, these things were done without modern welding. These things some of them were sand cast. And I've had this explained to me 3 or 4 times, and I still don't understand it. Or I understand it, but I still don't know how they did it, because they're extraordinary castings. Now, a lot of those castings, after they were in metal, a lot of the detail was actually chiseled back in to the pieces with different files and augers and various things. And this had a lot to do with why there's such a wide range in the quality of the casting, because some people were really good at it and some people weren't. And depending upon the foundry, it made a big difference. So, anything else?
I think we're good, Walter.
Okay, let's go on. So while things were sort of winding down in sort of the traditional animalier tradition, there were some amazing things going on. And let's actually go back to the previous slide just for a second. We can go backwards. So much of the work of the animalier folks was in effect situations. And the wonderful illustrator and painter Harold von Schmidt, in conversation with Bob Kuhn, who was one of the great animal painters of the United States in this century. Bob's dead now, but not long. Bob related this conversation to me that he had with Schmidt. He said, and Schmidt said, basically all paintings and sculptures are either situations or epics. And situations really dealt with detail, and epics only worked because of form. And most of the animalier pieces really were situational. They were this hunt. They were this interaction between this animal and that animal. Some of them were really beautiful forms. Obviously, the best of them were terrific forms. But that wasn't the primary intent of the artist. They were really detailing situations. When we go to the next group of people in Europe, next slide, please. We're dealing with people who really understood the situation perfectly well, but their interest was in basically the form of animals as basically sculptural elements. And the person who, frankly, did it best and I'm sorry to say, didn't do it very long because he killed himself I think at about 32 years old. I often say if he hadn't, there'd be no reason for any of us to do anything else because he was so prolific and so good, there'd be nothing left to do. But his name was Rembrandt Bugatti. You might recognize the name from the Bugatti racing car company in Italy, or you might recognize the name from the great furniture maker, Carlo Bugatti, who was his father. Bugatti was from Italy. He was a good friend, or his family friends were Paolo Trubetskoy, the incredible portrait sculptor. So he too was not self-taught, but he basically formed the sort of the next breach in the dike of people that finally said, you know, I've been to Paris, I have studied with Rodin, I have met the dying Berry, and this is not what I want to talk about. Next slide, please. Bugatti really took the simplification of the form and the accentuation of the gesture to really one of its highest points. All of his pieces are basically portraits. When you look at his early pieces, you can see very much the influence of Rodin on his work. Many of the textures, even the patination. As you get later into it, the forms get more and more abstracted, and the lines get stronger and stronger. Next, please. Until you get to these pieces that are they're incredibly romantic, but they're also incredibly strong. You wouldn't have to know what they were. I mean, you're no longer dealing with pieces of work where the story really is of any particular import. They simply, as forms, are so ridiculously beautiful. It is said that he did almost all of his pieces in less than a couple of days, most of them in a day, on, you know, at the zoo itself, looking at the animal itself. I find that both hard to believe on one side and completely believable on the other side, because it's really only looking at the living thing, looking at the movements while you're trying to sit down and say, okay, I don't have the time to get all the details right. I only have the time to get the lines right. And I think that's what's so powerful about what he did. There is not a lot of Bugatti material you can see in the United States. The Hirschhorn has the Hamadryas baboon on the left, and they also have the royal tiger, and they're worth seeing. They don't always have them out, which is, well, whatever. A few years ago, they had a wonderful Bugatti exhibition in Cleveland, and there's still catalogs from that show available. It basically was all three of it was the father, Carlo, because Cleveland had a number of fine pieces of his both furniture and silverware. Rembrandt with his animal sculptures, and they had a couple of great Bugatti cars that had been lent from someplace. It was a fabulous exhibition. Next, please. The people who went on from Bugatti that you would be familiar with is certainly Degas met Bugatti, and Bugatti met Degas. And when you look at Degas' horses, you can see it. Jonathan Kenworthy, who is still alive, he's I think from I guess he's from England now. But when you look at many of Jonathan Kenworthy's pieces, and I think he's probably the best living animal sculptor today. you look at his pieces, you look at Giacometti's pieces, and then on the bottom right, there's a piece by a young South African named Dylan Lewis, who I had the pleasure of hosting when he was a really little guy. He had come to New York. He was meeting with a man named Fred King, who owned a gallery called the Sportsman's Edge, which was the first gallery to deal with sporting and wildlife art in New York City. And Fred called me up and he said, "I've got this guy here from South Africa. I'm sending him down to stay with you for a week." And I was like, "Oh?" He goes, "Yeah, he's coming down on this train. Go get him." And we spent just a wonderful week together. And he's a genius. He's a fascinating guy. Now all of his pieces are selling for hundreds of thousands of dollars at Sotheby's in London, and they're fabulous. But the point is that these guys basically came out of the Bugatti tradition. Next, please. So, Bugatti was still dealing with these things, looking at life, and there was an abstraction to line and to form to a certain extent, but there was still very much the individual. In I'm going to forget this now, I think about 1922, Francois Pompon, who had been basically a marble polisher in Rodin's atelier, put a piece, and forgive me, I can't remember the actual name of it, but it was this polar bear. It was the Dor Frieze or something in the 1920 Paris Salon, and for whatever reason, it kind of rocked the world. It was one of the first very abstract animal pieces. And Pompon went on to, he wasn't very famous until he was. I'm not sure how to put, other than how to put it that way. And you can see a number of his pieces. Some of them have become, sort of popular items. They were sort of midway between Art Deco and, Francois Pompon. If you look at modern European animal sculpture, you will find that some that you may be familiar with, from Jeffrey Dashwood to oh heck, I don't know. I mean, but there's a number of the European animal sculptors. They trace their lineage of how they're looking at the world pretty directly to Francois Pompon. Next, please. At the same time, there was another guy who was really one of my favorites, who was a guy named Edouard Sandoz. And he, again, another guy that there are not many books on him. There's one actually quite good book. It's in French, but the pictures are in English, so it's okay. His range of work was just all over the place. It was great. Next, please. So take a look at these three pieces. These are both Francois Pompon pieces. And next, please. And these are Edouard Sandoz pieces. And these are in the 1920s. And now we're going to go to the next slide, and we're going to drop back to 1567. And basically, Geobologna he figured out all three styles of European animal sculpture, and he did it in one set of 14 bronzes, and he did it in 1567. Hence, I think he's really one of the great sculptors of all time. Next, please. again, these are modern, there's a number of modern sculptors. And if you look at them, you can see a bit of Sandoz in them. You can see a bit of Geobologna in them. You can see, yeah, things. Most great sculpture is not hatched, fully formed. It builds on lots and lots of other people's observations. But the quote on the top from Ellie Nadelman, I think, is another one that I got pinned on my wall, because even though it's sort of not how I approach what I do, I am always aware as I am working on pieces that my job is not simply to reproduce what's in front of me. My job is to figure out what about it is going to add some information, and what about it is going to give you sort of pleasure looking at it. Next, please. And we're okay. So we're going to stop at this point and ask any questions again.
We had someone come through, like, how does your work fit within the history of sculpture? Kind of a big question.
Well, no, I mean, I mean, given the context of what we're talking about, I am by tradition more situational. So much of my work is based on things I have experienced, and I try and dig out the sculptural possibilities of those experiences. On the other hand, I hope that when you look at my pieces, even if you don't know and don't understand the situation, the power of the composition and the attention to the form makes them pleasing objects to you. So I would like to think I have learned from all three of these traditions. Sometimes I do it better than other times, and some pieces simply lend themselves to more of a story than others, and some pieces really lend themselves to really concentrating on the forms. Within the show that's at the museum, certainly there are some. Oh, there's a covey rise of quail in corn. Well, that's a very situational thing. At the same time, the bas reliefs of the turkeys, the blackbird pieces, they really are about design and about form. And so I hope to straddle both objectives. Sometimes it works better than others, but whenever I start a piece, that's my intent.
Thank you. If anyone else has any questions, please feel free to take yourself off mute or type your question in the chat as we move throughout the program. We had a question in the chat. Although Bugatti's life was short, were there castings after his lifetime? From Mary.
So this is really interesting. Many of Bugatti's castings were monocasts, or they were done in 2s and 3s. On the other hand, if any of you all know Edward Horswell, Sladmore Gallery in London, Edward seems to keep coming up with beautiful Bugatti castings. So I don't know whether he's got the molds in the basement and he's just making them. No, they're not. I don't think anything was cast after his life. I'm not completely sure of that. Bugatti basically went to the First World War. He had one of these terrible experiences. All of the animals at the Antwerp Zoo were killed. He had, he had, various levels of depression, and at 32 years old, he killed himself. And he had literally done, there are a number of really good books on Bugatti now. Most, there's a book in French, Rizzoli has one, and there have been Edward Horswell's out of Slidemore Gallery has published 2 really good books based both on the shows and the rest of it, and they're worth looking at. He was an astounding sculptor. Yeah, but I don't know how many Bugatti castings there are out there, but there aren't that many, even though he did lots and lots of pieces. He probably, I think his catalog raisonné had over 400 and something pieces in it.
I think we're good, Walter.
Okay, is everybody still in? My God, you people are
We have
amazing.
one more. How many foundries are operating in the USA now? And are there some better than others? If you can answer that.
I can't answer the first because it's such a fluid number. All casting in the United States was pretty much an East Coast phenomenon, except for Gorham out in Los Angeles, and I think there was another one in I mean, I'm talking about art castings, not general foundry. Basically, what happened in casting technology was that in about 1975, 2 things happened. Oil went from $3 a barrel to $50 a barrel, and the Texans and Oklahomans decided that, by God, they were going to make Western art an art business, and a whole string of foundries opened up on the Front Range of the Rockies. And they were able to do that because of 2 technological advances. One was silicon rubber, which allowed you to make a mold of an original easily. Historically, molds of originals were made in plaster. It was very complicated. And you had to be, you had to have more than a high school degree in whatever to do it. With the advent of silicon rubber, well, even I can make a mold. I mean, it's just not that hard. The other thing, which was unexpected in a sense, was that the auto industry went from making their engine blocks, they went from sand casting to ceramic shell casting. And the technology of ceramic shell was such that it became basically very inexpensive to pour a bronze. Historically, you used to have to basically, with investment casting or sand casting, which was really hard, you had to really know what you were doing. And in the early 70s, you didn't have to know what you were doing. I mean, between the molds and the ceramic shell casting, any convict could work at a foundry. And modern TIG welding and MIG welding had come into existence, and also the quality of the metallurgy was such that you think of poor Geobologna back in 1570 when he was pouring those things. He probably had to pour them in one shot, which meant you had to do a crucible that was huge because they didn't have welding. They had Roman joints, they had a number of things, but he probably had to shoot a lot of those in like one shot, which was really complicated. Now with modern welding, you could have cast those things. I mean, there's a turkey I have out front of the museum. That thing was made in 18 pieces, welded together. You simply couldn't have done that historically. So the long and short answer is, yeah, there are good foundries, there are bad foundries. What there tend to be are good, reasonably priced foundries, good incredibly expensive foundries, bad cheap foundries, and bad expensive foundries. And how many of them are there? There are probably not more than a couple of dozen that people use, 24, 25 foundries. Yeah, yeah.
Where do you see contemporary representational art fitting within contemporary gallery spaces now?
You know, I wish I could say I've thought a lot about it, but I haven't. I mean, I think good stuff will rise to the top and bad stuff won't. There are some truth be told, I don't worry much about it. I go down, you know, you go into the stacks at the Met, you know, which was one of the great, or you go into the stacks upstairs in the Reynolds Center at the Museum of American Art now. And you go through row after row after row of really well done things, you know, they're like, but right now they don't seem to be making the traveling team. You know, they're not on display. I don't know, you know, maybe, you know, some smarty pants Claudia Pfeiffer will walk through them at some point and go, oh, wait a minute, these are really good. And they'll be able to put them into a historical context of what was going on at the time. And suddenly they'll be interesting again. I don't much worry about it.
And we have time for a couple of more questions before we move on. If anyone else has anything they'd like to add. Walter, do you have any more final thoughts? I know we did get a couple of private message questions asking if you had a particular favorite sculpture and artist and things like that within your own personal space.
I do, and I'm going to run through another 10. Well, actually, we don't have much time. I mean, everybody has their heroes. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, so I was exposed to tremendous work at the Cleveland Museum of Art. I worked for 7 or 8 years at the Natural History Museum in Cleveland as a taxidermist preparator, but I also did exhibit design and whatever. But they had 7 sculptures of the guy who really became my hero, which was a man named Albert Leslie. I think you can see some really good examples of his work at the Reynolds Center, the Museum of American Art. And I think I have actually sort of been chasing some of his ideas and how he treated subjects for my whole life. He did, he had the ability to simplify really complicated structures while at the same time pushing the gesture to really make exciting sculpture. So he's probably my favorite recently dead sculptor. I'll leave it at that. And he's the person I've learned the most from, just looking at. Whenever I see one of his pieces, I'll kind of go, oh, wow, that's how you treat that. I think, you know, long dead croakers. I mean, I fell in love with sculpture early, but seeing Paul Manship's Rainy Gates at the Bronx Zoo was a kind of a seminal scale struck from my eye moment. We were in New York for the New York World's Fair in 1964. I think I was 11 years old, and we drove by those gates, and I was like, "Oh my God, this would be cool! I wish I could do that." I'm a great lover of what I will call functional stuff. Some of my favorite sculpture is actually some of the metal work of Samuel Yellin, who is an iron worker. There's some amazing gates in the National Cathedral, and then where I grew up in Cleveland and in Pittsburgh, a number of homes had some amazing doors and gates that were done by him, and so that's always been sort of something that I've sort of been interested in, and you can see it in the work in the Blackbird pieces and the fire screens. So, you know, I mean, I'm pretty Catholic in what turns my crank on things. I see something and I'm like, whoa, that's terrific. And it is the best part of what we do, you know, as artists. It's, you know, we get to, you know, what's that great line? It's like the art of teaching is to know what to steal and from whom. And that's the same thing in painting and sculpture. I mean, it's, you know, the real art of it is to know what to steal and from whom. And I've stolen from lots of people.
Best way to learn.
Can I make a comment?
Of course.
Thank you. This is Grace. I mean, Walt is really a genius. I mean, he's very humble. I'm not sure he even realizes he is, but the thing that strikes you about his sculpture that really makes it stand out and is up to the level of all these other things that we've been saying is his sense of movement. And so yes, it is. He describes it as being situational, but he has this wonderful aesthetic beauty of a creature in a setting, so that you feel the about to take off, or the flight. You see the relationships of the different animals and the grass and the vegetation. You see in the screens. I would love to see them against a fire, because they already flicker, and his surfaces already have wonderful variety and a sense of lifelike lighting. So there's something beautifully dramatic but real. I don't know. You capture things in a way that's just amazing, and I just had to speak up because you're not going to say it about yourself.
We couldn't agree more. If you haven't had a chance to see the exhibition he has on display at the NSLM, it is gorgeous, and constantly get people saying how amazing it is.
Well, Grace, my dear, thank you for years and years of your friendship. And the one thing about animal sculpture, painting from life drawing, whatever it is that you move from simply wanting your hands to be able to reproduce what you're looking at, to a moment when you know your hands can do it, and the whole thing becomes a head game. It's a matter of, can you think what questions need to be answered? It's taken me a long time, but I think at this point, if I'm good at anything, it is identifying what questions really are worth exploring. And you can't do that really without a very strong basis of where this knowledge is coming from. And that's kind of what this talk is about. So I think we're out of time, and we've got half the talk to go, but I'm not going to worry about it.
So Walter, it's Claudia Pfeiffer. Thank you for calling me a smarty pants. I appreciate that comment very much. And as somebody who had the privilege of curating your exhibition, I don't think you're chasing Albert Lastly. You are uniquely you, sir, first off. And one of the things I really enjoyed about when we talked about this exhibition and really chatted about the directions that you went in and how you matured over the course of the last couple of decades, it's so evident that you are not only informed by all of these things you talked about today, but they've created a unique voice for you. And that idea of when we look at your sculpture now, we know that it's by Walter Matia, there's no question. And there's something very powerful about that.
Thank you. Well, at the most crass level, I should stop, but it's one of the great lines. I had a dealer from Texas, his name was Bubba Wood, who is very instrumental in a lot of things I've done over the years. But Bubba always used to say, if somebody has to look to find the name to know who did it, you really haven't done anything.
That's great. That's a great quote.
So anyway, good night. And listen, hopefully we can, in the years to come, we can do this again in person. We're going to try and do a talk, not to say next Saturday, from my studio, where we're going to go through some of the techniques. And in some ways, it'll be easier to discuss sort of the thought process that goes into these things. And we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, so as Walter mentioned, that program is going to be on December 11th. It's going to be a virtual program at 1 p.m. And I will say he has 2 studio dogs that are probably going to be appearing in the program at some point. And they're an absolute pleasure. And you can sign up for that online, or you can just email me at vpeacock@nationalsporting.org. We also have his exhibition catalog for the current exhibition at the NSLM, Field Notes Walter Matia, and that's available in our gift shop or online, and they do make great Christmas presents. And his exhibition is up until January 9th, 2022. If you haven't had a chance to come out and see it, I definitely would. It is absolutely amazing. And we're open Thursday through Sunday, 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. And this program has been recorded, and I will be sending you a private YouTube link in the coming weeks with this recording on it. So thank you all and have a great night, and we'll hope to see you again soon. Thank you so much, Walter, for taking the time to talk with us.
Thank you, guys. It's my pleasure. It really is.
Have a great
Thank you for a wonderful program.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.